He trained dogs to detect cancer in others, but had no idea the life they'd save was his own. Dr. Mark Elliott's career was built on helping others, diagnosing and curing cancer in humans. His life, however, was one of routine. Day in, day out, he worked with patients, training dogs like Scout to alert on potential cancer cases. But there was one thing he never expected to train the dog for: his own survival. Scout, a 4-year-old Labrador Retriever, had already proven his worth with countless patients. His nose was impeccable, his instincts perfect. But Scout began to do something odd. Instead of alerting to patients, he kept focusing on Dr. Mark. At first, Mark laughed it off. Dogs can be quirky, right? He ignored Scout's repeated behavior, thinking it was just a coincidence. But Scout's persistence was hard to dismiss. Every time Mark brushed it off, Scout would sit or nudge him with that focused gaze. The little dog who was trained to save lives was now trying to save the very man who had trained him. Yet, Mark remained convinced that he was fine. He wasn't sick, he wasn't the one who needed saving. That belief would shatter months later, when Dr. Mark collapsed unexpectedly during a quiet evening at home. Scout was frantic, barking and scratching at the door until neighbors came to the rescue. It was too late. Dr. Mark had collapsed from an advanced stage of cancer, the very condition Scout had been warning him about. Dr. Mark Elliott stood in the brightly lit training room, his hands confidently patting the side of his Labrador Retriever, Scout. The dog's coat gleamed a soft cream color in the fluorescent lights, and his ears perked up as Mark spoke to him, praising him for his work. "You're getting better, buddy," Mark said with a smile, the exhaustion of the long day settling into his bones. Scout wagged his tail, his bright, intelligent eyes staring up at Mark as if to say, "I know I am." For Mark, working with animals had always been more than just a job, it was his life. As a veterinary oncologist, he specialized in training dogs to detect early signs of cancer in humans. Over the years, his work had saved countless lives. The dogs, with their incredible sense of smell, could pick up on the faintest of scents, chemical signals emitted by cancerous cells. It was a gift that seemed almost supernatural, and Mark had honed it, teaching the dogs to alert their handlers when they detected these smells. Scout, in particular, had been one of his most promising students. The 4-year-old Labrador Retriever had an almost uncanny ability to identify the specific scent markers of certain types of cancer. His loyalty, combined with his natural instinct, made him the perfect companion for the job. Mark had watched him excel in his training over the past few months, and he couldn't have been more proud. As part of the protocol, Scout would work alongside Mark in various sessions, sniffing patients and then alerting to the presence of cancer. It was always a clear and unmistakable response, a specific nudge or sit when Scout found something. It was during these sessions that Mark saw the true power of his work. A dog trained to detect the early warning signs of a disease that had plagued so many people. But lately, something strange had begun happening. Scout, who had always been focused on the patients, started showing a distinct change in behavior. Instead of alerting to the patients, he had begun focusing on Mark. It started small, a nudge here, a sit there, but it didn't take long for Mark to notice. At first, he thought it was just a quirk of the dog's behavior. After all, Scout had worked so hard and perhaps he was just looking for attention. But the behavior became more persistent. During a routine training session with a cancer patient named Mrs. Taylor, Mark watched Scout intently. The dog had been scanning the air as he always did, but then he turned and stared directly at Mark. A low whine came from the dog's throat as he continued to fixate on him. Mark shook his head, momentarily distracted from his work. He gently patted Scout's head, trying to redirect him. "Not today, Scout," Mark murmured, his voice lighthearted. "We're here to help Mrs. Taylor, remember?" Scout's gaze didn't waver. He whined again, this time more urgently, and Mark raised an eyebrow. Mrs. Taylor, who had been watching the interaction, looked at Mark with concern. "Is something wrong with the dog?" she asked, her voice tinged with confusion. Mark smiled and waved his hand dismissively. No, Scout's just being a bit fussy today. It happens sometimes. Don't worry about it." But as the days went on, the pattern continued. Every time they worked together, Scout's focus shifted back to Mark, and the dog would alert as if something was wrong. Mark began to feel uneasy. It was as though Scout was trying to tell him something he couldn't understand. But Mark, ever the rational doctor, brushed it off. He had no reason to believe that anything was wrong with him. He was healthy after all. He'd had regular checkups, and no test had ever shown anything concerning. Despite Scout's insistence, Mark continued to ignore the signs. He chalked it up to the dog's instinct, perhaps picking up on some subtle change in his behavior or scent that Mark himself hadn't noticed. But there was a nagging feeling at the back of his mind. One that he couldn't quite shake off. Something told him that Scout was trying to say more than he could understand. It had been a few weeks since Scout had first started acting strangely. Mark continued with his routine, working with other patients, training the dog, and ignoring the increasing number of signals Scout sent his way. Each time the dog would sit or nudge him during a session, Mark would gently push him aside, focusing on the patient in front of him. But deep down there was a growing unease. Scout was persistent, more persistent than he had ever been before. One morning, after finishing a particularly long day of training with a patient named Mr. Harris, Mark felt a deep exhaustion in his bones. As he locked up the clinic and prepared to leave, Scout, who had been unusually quiet, looked up at him with those big brown eyes, his gaze intense and unwavering. Mark paused, sensing something was off. "Scout, what is it?" he muttered, more to himself than to the dog. But Scout didn't budge. Instead, he slowly walked toward Mark, sitting at his feet and looking up at him with that knowing stare. Mark sighed, running a hand through his hair. All right, you've got my attention. What is it?" He crouched down, meeting Scout's gaze. It was hard to ignore the dog's insistence, but Mark couldn't bring himself to believe there was any reason for concern. After all, he was a doctor and he knew his own body better than anyone else. But Scout's actions were starting to wear on him. Later that evening, as Mark sat in his small apartment reviewing patient files, Scout lay at his feet, his eyes never leaving him. The silence in the room felt thick, almost suffocating. It was then that Mark began to feel something he hadn't before, a subtle ache in his chest. It wasn't anything severe, but it was enough to make him pause and place his hand over his heart. It had been there for a few days, but he hadn't given it much thought. He chalked it up to stress, a side effect of the long hours and emotionally taxing work he did. He had been burning the candle at both ends, trying to keep up with the increasing demand for his expertise. Still, there was something nagging at him, an unsettling feeling that only grew stronger the longer Scout stayed by his side, watching him. The next morning, Mark made an appointment with his primary care physician. Just to be safe, he told himself as he went through the motions. He didn't think much of it. After all, he wasn't one to overreact. The checkups were routine, and the ache in his chest could easily be attributed to something minor. Stress maybe. Or even a muscle strain from leaning over patients all day. But when he entered the doctor's office, the sense of dread crept up his spine. His doctor, a good friend of his, greeted him with a concerned smile. "Mark, what's going on? You don't usually come in unless something's really bothering you." Mark shrugged it off. "It's nothing really. Just this dull ache in my chest. Probably nothing to worry about. I thought I'd get it checked out anyway just to be safe." The doctor nodded, but the concerned look didn't leave his face. He ran a series of tests, some routine and others a bit more thorough. When Mark left the office, he felt a strange sense of unease. He hadn't expected much from the visit. But as the day wore on, he found himself constantly thinking about the tests. Something didn't sit right with him. That evening, after another long day, Mark returned home to find Scout once again sitting by the door. The dog had been unusually quiet that day, and Mark could feel the weight of Scout's gaze on him. He dropped his keys onto the counter and sighed, feeling the tension in his body begin to build. Scout's constant presence, always so watchful, was beginning to feel like a reminder of something important. Something he wasn't quite ready to face. Just as Mark sat down to rest, his phone rang. He picked it up without thinking, expecting it to be one of the clinic's patients. But it was his doctor, and the sound of his voice immediately sent a jolt of fear through Mark's body. "Mark, I need you to come in. Now," his doctor said, his tone serious. "We found something. You need to get here as soon as possible." Mark felt his stomach drop, the weight of those words sinking in. Something was wrong. The ache in his chest, the exhaustion, the way Scout had been acting, it was all connected. But what did it mean? Mark could hardly breathe as he hung up the phone, the words from his doctor echoing in his mind. "We found something. You need to get here as soon as possible." The urgency in the doctor's voice left no room for doubt. It wasn't a good sign. He quickly grabbed his jacket and without a second thought rushed out the door with Scout at his heels. As Mark drove to the clinic, his mind raced. He tried to convince himself that it was probably nothing, just some minor issue, perhaps a pulled muscle or stress-related discomfort. But deep down, a gnawing fear had taken root. The ache in his chest had been there for weeks, but he had ignored it. He had always considered himself healthy, strong even. But now, as his hands tightened on the steering wheel, the fear was too real to ignore. When Mark arrived at the clinic, his doctor was waiting for him, a somber expression on his face. Without wasting any time, the doctor led Mark to an examination room, and they began reviewing the test results together. "Mark, I'm afraid the tests show something concerning," the doctor said, sitting down across from him. "You've got a mass on your lungs and it appears to be malignant. We'll need further tests to confirm the stage and type, but based on the results, I'm confident it's cancer." The world seemed to shift beneath Mark's feet. Cancer. He had trained so many dogs to detect it in others, yet now it was his own body that was betraying him. He sat there in stunned silence, the weight of the diagnosis settling over him like a thick fog. How is this possible?" Mark asked, his voice barely above a whisper. He was a doctor, someone who prided himself on knowing everything about the human body. He had lived a healthy life, had no family history of cancer. How could this be happening to him? The doctor looked at him with sympathy. "Sometimes cancer can develop without obvious signs or family history. It's not uncommon, but it's certainly not easy. We'll need to do more tests to see the full extent, but I wanted to get you started on a treatment plan right away." Mark nodded, though he wasn't fully processing the words. His mind was still reeling from the shock. Cancer. He never thought it would happen to him. But here he was, sitting in a sterile examination room, facing the very disease he had spent his life helping others detect. The next few days felt like a blur. Mark went through the necessary tests and scans, each one confirming what the doctor had said. The tumor was in its advanced stages and it had already spread. The prognosis wasn't good. He had no symptoms until recently, and the cancer had gone unnoticed for months, maybe even longer. But throughout it all there was one constant: Scout. The dog who had been alerting Mark for weeks, the one who had sensed something was wrong before Mark himself had any idea. Mark couldn't shake the feeling that Scout had known. That Scout had been trying to warn him. On the evening of his final consultation, after Mark had been given the full extent of the diagnosis, he sat alone in his apartment. The air felt thick with the weight of his thoughts. He looked over at Scout, who was sitting calmly by the door, watching him with those big knowing eyes. The dog's presence was both comforting and haunting. How had Scout known before Mark did? How had he been able to pick up on the subtle changes in his body, the chemical shifts that signaled the presence of cancer? It was a mystery that Mark couldn't solve. But in that moment he realized something important. Scout hadn't just been trained to help others. He had been trained to save lives. And maybe, just maybe, Scout had been trying to save his. Mark let out a deep sigh and patted Scout's head gently. "You were right, boy," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "You were right all along." As Scout looked up at him, his tail wagging slightly, Mark felt a strange sense of gratitude wash over him. He had ignored the dog's warnings, dismissed them as a mere coincidence. But now he couldn't deny the bond they shared. Scout had been more than just a working dog. He had been Mark's guardian in ways that Mark hadn't understood until now. The morning after the full diagnosis, Mark stood at his bathroom sink, gripping the edges like it was the only thing holding him up. His face in the mirror looked pale, tired, older than he remembered. The weight of the truth pressed down on his shoulders. Stage 3. Possibly stage 4. Aggressive. Inoperable. Without shrinking at first thought, he splashed cold water on his face and stared at himself again. And for the first time he saw not just a vet or a trainer, but a man who had to fight for his life. Scout patted in quietly and sat beside the bathroom door, watching. Mark turned and gave a faint smile. "I guess you knew before anyone, didn't you?" he said, crouching to run a hand gently over Scout's thick golden fur. Scout leaned into his hand, eyes soft and alert. That day Mark didn't go to work. Instead he made phone calls. One to his clinic, informing them of a sudden leave of absence. Another to his sister in Arizona, who hadn't heard from him in nearly a year. And then, the hardest call, to the cancer center. They scheduled a PET scan, chemo prep, and consults. It all felt clinical, overwhelming, like someone else's life being scheduled. But Mark wasn't in denial anymore. Scout had pulled him out of that. At the cancer center 2 days later, Mark sat in the waiting room with Scout at his feet. The receptionist smiled kindly at the dog. "We don't usually allow animals, but I heard your story. He stays." Mark was surprised. "You heard?" She nodded. "You're the vet who trains dogs to detect cancer, right? They said your own dog diagnosed you?" Mark gave a sheepish smile. "I didn't believe him at first." She leaned over the counter. "He might have saved your life." That line echoed in Mark's mind all day. Later the oncologist walked him through the treatment plan. Chemotherapy followed by radiation. They would monitor the tumor's response. Surgery was off the table, at least for now. The chemo would be intense, but it was their best shot. Mark sat quietly, nodding, absorbing every word. Then he asked, "What are my odds?" The doctor paused. "We don't like to talk in numbers. Every person responds differently. But if we start now, there's a chance. And with how early your dog caught it, that might be what gives you the edge." That night back home, Mark cooked Scout his favorite, grilled chicken. They ate side by side on the floor, Scout happily wagging his tail. The apartment felt different now, like it had a new kind of silence. Not fear. Not grief. Something steadier. Determination. Mark looked over at the dog who had been by his side for years. "Scout, we've trained to help others. We've given everything we had. But now, I need your help more than ever." Scout tilted his head as if listening. And then he placed a paw on Mark's knee. A gesture that said, "I'm here. We'll do this together." The first round of chemo was brutal. Mark had always thought he was tough. Years of working long shifts, emergencies, surgeries, handling trauma cases, he thought he'd seen pain. But this was different. The nausea, the fatigue, the way food turned to ash in his mouth, it drained him. But through it all, Scout never left. He lay by Mark's side every night. He nudged water bowls closer when Mark was too tired to get up. He pressed his nose against Mark's wrist during low moments, like he was checking in. More than once, Mark woke up from a chemo nap to find Scout curled tightly beside him, eyes on the door, guarding. One afternoon, as Mark sat wrapped in a blanket by the window, he looked down and whispered, "You're not just a dog, are you?" Scout looked up, blinked slowly and leaned his head into Mark's lap. And Mark cried. Not because he was weak. Not because of pain. But because he realized, in all his years of saving animals, training them, believing in their abilities, he had never truly understood the depth of what they could give back. Scout had given him a chance. A warning. A second shot at life. Now it was time for Mark to honor that. To fight. To survive. The days blurred into weeks. Chemotherapy became a rhythm, a painful, slow one. Mark lost weight. His hair began to thin. The once energetic vet now struggled with basic things. Walking upstairs, cooking, even standing for more than a few minutes. But every time he faltered, Scout was there, like clockwork. The dog never missed a beat. Scout had once been trained to detect cancer in patients at early stages. Now he adapted, sensing dips in Mark's energy, moods, and even blood sugar. When Mark got dizzy, Scout would stand close for balance. When Mark couldn't get out of bed, Scout would nudge his hand with a leash, a gentle reminder to try. The vet clinic sent cards. Colleagues dropped by with soup, flowers, well wishes. But it was Scout who stayed 24/7. Loyal. Alert. Devoted. One late afternoon, after a particularly harsh treatment, Mark was wheeled out of the oncology center. He sat in a shaded corner of the garden, wearing a hoodie, too exhausted to move. Scout sat beside him on the bench, resting his head on Mark's knee. A young woman in a headscarf approached. She looked about 20, pale from treatment too, but bright-eyed. She smiled gently at Scout. "He yours?" Mark nodded weakly. "Yeah, that's Scout." "He looks like a therapist in disguise," she said, chuckling. "He's more than that," Mark replied. "He saved my life." The woman sat down a few feet away, her own four stand beside her. "Funny how dogs do that. My dad was a vet. Had a lab named Chester that wouldn't stop barking at his back. Tumor the size of a golf ball. Saved him too." Mark raised a brow. "So maybe it's a thing. Maybe dogs are just smarter than us," she said. "They love better at least." They sat in silence, listening to the birds and distant hospital buzz. Later, back at home, Mark started a new habit, journaling. At first it was just scribbles, how he felt, pain levels, food that made him nauseous. But soon it became something else, a quiet dialogue with Scout. He wrote letters. "Dear Scout, you knew. I ignored you. I nearly ran out of time. I owe you everything. You found comfort in it. When the treatments got worse, when sleep wouldn't come, when he thought he might not make it, he wrote to Scout. And Scout listened in silence." Weeks later, Mark returned to the clinic, not as a vet but as a patient with a scan. He sat stiffly in the radiology waiting room, heart pounding. Scout lay beside him in his harness, tail swishing lightly. The technician gave Mark a soft nod and called him in. The scan was quick, cold, clinical. Then the long wait. In the oncologist's office, Mark sat across from the doctor who was reviewing the new images. The silence stretched as she clicked through slides on the screen. Mark's mouth went dry. Finally she looked up. "It's shrinking," she said. Mark blinked. "What?" "The tumor's shrinking. Significant response to treatment. We can't say we're out of the woods, but this is good. Very good. Mark exhaled slowly, then buried his face in his hands. Scout stood and placed his front paws on the armrest beside him, licking his cheek gently. For the first time since the diagnosis, hope lit a fire inside him. Not just a glimmer, a steady flame. Later that evening, Mark sat on the floor of his living room, Scout curled beside him. The golden retriever was asleep, snoring softly. Mark looked down at him, tears silently falling. "I think you knew this would happen," he whispered. "You never gave up. So I won't either." He reached for his journal and flipped to a blank page. "Dear Scout, I think we're going to win this. Together." The buzzing lights in the hospital corridor hummed above Mark as he walked slowly with Scout by his side. His gait was slower now, his strength a fraction of what it used to be. Scout, tethered loosely to his wrist, matched his pace perfectly. It had become second nature. The staff knew them both by now. The oncology nurse, Jenna, waved as they entered the treatment ward. "There's my favorite patient," she smiled, then leaned down to pat Scout. "And my favorite guardian angel." Scout gave a polite tail wag but remained vigilant, eyes scanning every movement around Mark as if still on duty. Mark sat in his usual reclining chair, the vinyl squeaking as he settled in. The nurse busied herself prepping the four, disinfecting the port on his chest while Mark looked at Scout. The dog had taken to lying across his feet during the infusions, like a weighted blanket that breathed. As the chemo drip began, Mark reached down and lightly scratched Scout behind the ears. "Guess what?" he murmured. "They said the tumor's shrinking." Scout thumped his tail once but didn't move. Mark looked out the window. It was snowing. Each flake was a whisper from the sky, soft and silent. 6 weeks ago he wasn't sure he'd see winter again. Now he was watching it from a warm room, Scout pressed into him like an anchor in a storm. He thought of all the patients he'd helped, the dogs he'd trained, the lectures he'd given on early detection. But somehow he'd missed his own signs. Scout didn't. And that thought both comforted and shamed him. 2 weeks later, Mark began writing an article. Not a medical one. Not for a journal. But something real. Something human. Title: The Dog Who Diagnosed Me. He started slow. "I've spent 20 years training dogs to detect what humans often miss. I never thought one would save me from myself." It wasn't just about cancer anymore. It was about trust. About listening. About how we teach animals to serve us, but rarely pause to ask what they're trying to say back. He included everything: how Scout had pawed at his chest. How he dismissed the signs. How Scout had pressed on even when Mark ignored him. How, in the end, the dog he trained to save strangers had ended up saving him. One afternoon, while editing the draft, Mark's old student, Leah, called. "Mark, I saw your name in the vet newsletter. Heard you're writing again?" He laughed softly. "Trying to. Got a story to tell. The dog won't let me keep it to myself." Leah hesitated. "You know, I never told you this, but when you trained Scout in my class, I knew he was special. He was so focused. Not just obedient, in tune. Like he saw something beyond scent. Beyond science." Mark stared at Scout, who was napping in a sunbeam. "Yeah, he saw me, Leah. Before I even did." She grew quiet. "Can I share your article with my students when it's done?" "Please do." A few days later, Mark and Scout visited the children's ward. It started by accident. A nurse had asked him to stop by and say hello to a little girl who loved dogs. Mark hesitated at first, unsure if he could handle the emotion of a pediatric ward. But Scout walked in like he belonged there. The girl, bald from chemo, eyes huge in her tiny face, reached out as Scout patted toward her. "He's golden," she whispered. "Like the sun." Mark knelt. "His name is Scout. He's the reason I'm still here. Can I hug him?" Scout sat gently, letting the girl wrap her thin arms around his neck. He didn't move, didn't even blink, just leaned in, soft and still. Later, the hospital asked if Scout could be registered as a therapy dog. They'd cover the cost. The staff said they'd never seen such calm, such quiet power in an animal. Mark smiled. He's already a healer. Always has been. That night, back home, Mark opened the window. Cold wind rushed in, crisp and biting. But he didn't mind. Scout curled up beside the couch, ears twitching as Mark played with the draft of his article again. He changed the ending. From, "and he saved my life," to, "and he taught me how to live." Mark stood in front of the mirror, buttoning his shirt with slow, practiced hands. He paused to look at his reflection, not out of vanity but disbelief. The man staring back at him had color in his face again. His cheeks weren't as hollow. His eyes, though still tired, held a quiet strength. The port in his chest would be removed next week. The scans had shown what his doctors called a remarkable response. Scout was sitting behind him, tail swishing across the hardwood floor like a slow metronome. He watched Mark with alert eyes as if reading every flicker of thought in his movements. "You ready, partner?" Mark asked. Scout let out a low, happy bark. Today was important. Not because of a scan. Not because of a milestone. Today Mark was returning to the training center, the place he had avoided for nearly a year. The place where it all began. When he arrived, the old building looked just as he remembered. Fenced training yards. A row of kennels. The scent of damp earth and fur. Students gathered near the entrance, clipboards in hand, whispering as he approached. "Is that him?" "That's Dr. Mark." "And that's Scout." The Scout. He could feel their eyes on him, not out of pity but awe. And something else. Gratitude. Leah met him at the door. "You look alive," she smiled, tears flickering in her eyes. "I feel alive." She led him into the main hall where a group of new trainees were seated. These were not just future handlers. They were dreamers, people who had come to learn how to give dogs a language humans could understand. Mark stood at the front. Scout sat beside him, perfectly still like a living statue. He cleared his throat. "I used to teach science here. Data. Accuracy. Thresholds and scent markers. But there's something we don't talk about enough." He paused, scanning the room. "Instinct. That moment when the dog tells you something's wrong, and you choose whether or not to listen. Scout told me. Again and again. I didn't listen. I was the expert after all." Some students shifted uncomfortably. Others leaned in. But he saved me anyway. He knelt beside Scout and placed a hand on his back. "You're here to train dogs. But if you're lucky, if you really pay attention, one day your dog will train you." After the lecture, students crowded around Scout, asking questions, taking photos, laughing when he licked their hands. One young man, maybe 20, with nervous eyes, stayed back, clutching a folder. Mark noticed. "You okay?" he asked. The student hesitated. "My mom was just diagnosed. Breast cancer. Stage 2. I wasn't sure if I should stay in the program, but your story, it gave me hope." Mark rested a hand on his shoulder. "Hope is the first step. Keep going. Scout and I will be rooting for you." That evening Mark and Scout took the long way home. They walked through the park, bare trees overhead, fallen leaves crunching beneath their steps. The world was cold but not harsh. It felt like a fresh page. A group of children were playing with a frisbee in the distance. One of them, a little girl, pointed. "Look, Mommy. A real-life rescue dog." Mark smiled. Scout wagged. And then, suddenly, Scout froze. His ears snapped forward, nose twitching, eyes fixed on a man sitting alone on a bench. Mark's blood chilled. It was the exact behavior Scout had shown, before his own diagnosis. He approached the man gently. "Hey, sorry, I know this is strange. But my dog, he's trained to detect cancer. And he's alerting on you." The man blinked. "What?" Mark knelt beside Scout. The dog didn't budge. Just stared, unwavering. "I'm not saying it's anything. But if I were you, I'd get checked." The man laughed nervously. "That's ridiculous." Mark handed him a card. "Call me if you want to talk." Then he walked away. That night as he lay in bed, Mark stared at the ceiling. Scout lay curled by the door, breathing slow and steady. Mark whispered, "You're not done, are you?" Scout opened one eye. "No, not done at all." 3 weeks had passed since that quiet evening in the park, the moment when Scout locked eyes on a stranger and refused to move. Mark hadn't forgotten. How could he? That exact behavior had once predicted his own diagnosis. That frozen alert, the intense stare, the low, vibrating whine in Scout's throat, it haunted him. But life had moved on. Mark had returned to a part-time role at the training center. His body was still recovering from treatment, and the fatigue came in waves, but teaching gave him purpose again. Scout had also changed since that evening in the park. More alert, more serious. His instincts, it seemed, were still razor-sharp. Then one morning as Mark brewed his coffee, his phone buzzed. A known number. He let it ring once, twice. Then something told him to answer. "Hello." A voice came through, hesitant, gravelly. "Hi. I think we met. A few weeks ago. In the park. Your dog." Mark stood still. "The bench?" "Yeah. I thought you were crazy, to be honest. But something about the way your dog looked at me, I couldn't get it out of my head." Mark gripped the edge of the counter. "I booked a checkup. Didn't tell anyone. Thought I was wasting my time." There was a pause. It's lung cancer. Early stage. They think it's treatable. Mark exhaled, long and slow, almost like he'd been holding his breath for weeks. I don't know how to thank you, the man said. You already did, Mark replied softly. You listened. That night, Mark sat beside Scout on the porch. The wind rustled through the trees and the stars hung low and clear. Scout had his head on Mark's lap, eyes half shut, tail occasionally flicking like a metronome of peace. You did it again, buddy, Mark whispered. You're saving lives and you don't even know it. Scout blinked slowly, then licked his hand. The story of Scout's detection spread faster than Mark had expected. It began with a short article on a local vet blog, something simple and matter-of-fact. But then a reporter from a regional news outlet picked it up. A dog who had detected his trainer's cancer, and then alerted on a stranger weeks later? It was the kind of story that sparked something in people. Hope. Soon Mark's inbox was flooded. Emails from dog lovers, cancer survivors, medical researchers, even a few skeptics who wanted to test Scout's abilities. Mark ignored those. But one message stood out. It was from a hospital, a children's oncology center. They wanted to know, would Scout come visit? Not for testing. Not for validation. For the kids. They believed in hope too. The hospital was white, too clean, the air filled with a sterile chill. Mark hated these places. They reminded him of 4 bags and monitors and sterile food trays. But as they stepped inside, Scout's tail started to wag. He knew. The children were gathered in a bright, mural-filled playroom. Some were sitting on beanbags. Some were in wheelchairs. One girl sat with a scarf wrapped around her bald head, holding a stuffed lion to her chest. When Scout entered, the entire room shifted. Smiles. Gasp. Laughter. He didn't bark. He didn't jump. He just walked calmly from child to child, pressing his snout to each one, wagging his tail gently, letting tiny hands stroke his golden fur. Mark watched silently, his throat tight. This wasn't training. It was something deeper. Something sacred. One boy, pale and frail, reached out with trembling fingers. Scout walked over and sat, placing a paw in the boy's lap. The boy looked up at Mark. Is he magic? Mark smiled, kneeling down. No. He's just paying attention. After the visit, Mark sat in the hospital garden while Scout drank from a fountain nearby. A nurse came to him quietly. Thank you for this. That little boy you spoke to? That was the first time he smiled in 3 months. Mark swallowed hard. He reminds me of me. That night, back at home, Mark stood in front of his old filing cabinet. He hadn't opened it in months. It was where all his research used to live, scent tracking reports, training logs, medical literature on cancer metabolites. He hesitated. Then he opened the drawer. Inside were Scout's original scent discrimination records, pages and pages of detailed notes. Alerts. Mrs. Mark had written every reaction Scout made, even the ones he had brushed off. He ran his hand over the files, slowly. What if there was more to this than instinct? What if it could be measured? What if Scout wasn't just lucky, but reliable? The implications hit him like a wave. If this could be proven, if Scout's alerts could be studied, replicated, they could change diagnostics forever. They could teach other dogs. But that meant stepping back into the scientific world. Into skepticism. Peer review. Funding wars. It meant being vulnerable. And it meant asking Scout to keep doing what he did best, not just for him but for others. He turned to where Scout lay on the living room rug, already asleep. You up for it, partner? Mark whispered. Scout didn't stir. But his tail tapped once against the floor. Yes. The next morning, Mark awoke to a different kind of heaviness in his chest. Not the kind he had once feared, but one born of responsibility. He sat at his desk long before sunrise, Scout curled beside his chair. On the table were 3 things: his original training logs, a half-drunk cup of coffee, and a fresh notebook titled Project Scout. He flipped it open. Page 1, this is where we begin again. Mark's re-entry into the research world wasn't gentle. He reached out to old colleagues. Some were kind, some skeptical. One email came from a former professor. Mark, scent-based detection in canines is still seen as pseudoscience by many. You sure you want to stir that pot again? But Mark didn't hesitate this time. He saved my life. He saved another. If that's not worth studying, then what is? And so began the long weeks of tests, trials, and measurements. You know, Greg said, I wake up every morning and I pet my dog and wonder if he'll ever look at me the way yours looked at me that night. Mark chuckled softly. Let's hope he doesn't. Scout was placed in a scent discrimination room again. But now things were more refined, more deliberate. Samples came from confirmed patients, healthy individuals, and everything in between. Scout sniffed each vial with his usual calm, wagged once, sat firmly when something was wrong. Statistically, he was off the charts. The story caught wind in academic circles. Then came the breakthrough. A small university agreed to fund a pilot study. They wanted to see if Scout's methods could be trained into other dogs. Mark would oversee the process. It was the recognition he'd never sought but suddenly found himself standing inside of. Weeks turned into months. Scout wasn't just a dog anymore, he was becoming a mentor to other canines in training. Golden retrievers, Labradors, even a high-strung German shepherd named Arrow who didn't like anyone but instantly bonded with Scout. Mark watched with quiet awe. He had once thought his life was over. Now it was multiplying in purpose. Then one evening as Mark left the center, he found himself at the edge of the same park where it had all started. The bench was still there. And sitting on it, as if fate had looped back to check on him, was the man Scout had once alerted on. His name was Greg. He looked stronger now, a bit thinner, but smiling. He stood when he saw Mark. They both laughed. Then Greg grew quiet. "I'm clean now. The treatment worked. I wanted to say thank you again. You told me to trust your dog. Not even you, just your dog." "That's wild, man." Mark looked down at Scout, who sat patiently between them. "It's not wild," he said. "It's what he was born to do." A few days later, Mark received a letter in the mail. No return address. Inside was a simple typed message on heavy white paper. "Sometimes angels don't have wings. They have 4 legs, a golden coat, and a nose that doesn't miss a thing. Thank you, Scout." Mark stared at the letter for a long time, tears welling up again, not from pain this time but from something purer. Pride. Gratitude. A local news crew came to do a small feature on Scout's work. The interview was quiet, humble, just Mark and Scout sitting under the oak tree outside the training center. The reporter asked, "Do you think your dog knows he saved you?" Mark looked into the camera and then down at Scout. "I think he knew before I did." That night, Scout curled up at the foot of the bed like always. But this time, as Mark turned off the light, he whispered something he hadn't said in a very long time. "Good night, hero." Scout's tail thumped twice against the floor. The air in the small auditorium buzzed with quiet anticipation. Rows of chairs were filled, students, doctors, researchers, and even a few families who had benefited from early cancer detection. Scout sat beside Mark on stage, his head held high, wearing a blue vest stitched with the words, "Medical Detection Dog." Mark stepped up to the podium. He glanced down at his notes but didn't use them. He looked at Scout. Then at the crowd. "I want to tell you a story," he began, voice calm, steady. "About a dog who was trained to save lives, but ended up saving mine first." The room was silent. He spoke not just about the science but the moments, the ignored signs, the collapse, the diagnosis, and that fateful night Scout wouldn't give up. He didn't dramatize it. He just told the truth. By the end, there wasn't a dry eye in the room. One elderly doctor stood to clap first. Then the rest followed. It was more than applause, it was a recognition of something real, something pure. That even with all our tools and machines, sometimes the sharpest sense in the room belongs to a dog with a golden coat and an unwavering heart. Outside, the sun dipped low. Mark and Scout sat on a bench overlooking the field where they now trained others. A young girl ran by with a Labrador pup on a leash. The pup barked joyfully at Scout, who responded with a gentle woof, as if passing the torch. Mark smiled. He took a deep breath. "Funny, isn't it?" he said softly to Scout. "I thought I was training you, but really, you were preparing me for everything I never saw coming." Scout leaned in, resting his head on Mark's knee. Mark never ignored a signal again. He listened, to science, to instinct, and most importantly, to the dog who gave him a second chance at life. Scout lived out his years not just as a pet, but as a teacher, a pioneer, and a legend in his field. And Mark? He never stopped sharing Scout's story. At every conference, every lecture, every quiet conversation with a family on the edge of fear, he told them, "Don't ignore the signs, not from your body and not from the ones who love you even if they have 4 legs. If you were moved by this story, share it with someone you love. You never know who might need to hear it." Early detection saves lives, and sometimes the quietest warnings come from the most unexpected heroes. Paw prints. Speech balloon, tell us in the comments. Have you ever had a pet sense something before you did? We'd love to hear your story. Bell, don't forget to like, subscribe, and follow for more true stories of courage, loyalty, and second chances.